when I decided to start over in Ashwood, my hometown. I thought it would be the balm to heal my wrecked life. The city I'd left behind had taken everything: my job, my marriage, my dignity. I came back looking for solace, convinced that the endless fields and suffocating quiet of the Midwest would help me rebuild. I was wrong. What I found instead was something darker, something that had been waiting for me. The town itself had hardly changed in the years I'd been away. The same crumbling storefronts lined Main Street, their neon signs flickering weakly against the encroaching dark. The same rusting trucks rumbled down the roads, their drivers nodding in silent acknowledgement as they passed. And then there was Holloway Road, a narrow strip of asphalt that snaked through the dense woods just outside of town. A road that seemed to exist only in whispers and half-finished sentences. I first heard about it from Thomas Harker, my neighbor. Thomas was a relic of Ashwood, the kind of man who seemed to have grown roots into the town's very soil. He'd shown up at my front porch one evening, his battered straw hat casting long shadows over his lined face. "You settling in, Caleb?" he asked, leaning heavily on the railing like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Trying to," I said, motioning to the half-unpacked boxes littering my living room. He nodded, his gaze drifting toward the edge of the woods. "You been out to Holloway Road yet?" I shook my head. "Can't say I have. Should I?" "Best not to," he said flatly, his usual casual drawl hardening into something sharp. "That road's got a history. Bad things happen there. Always have." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of bad things?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if the trees might be listening. "Accidents. People losing control for no good reason. Cars, trucks, bikes, it doesn't matter. Some say it's the road itself, cursed from the time it was first laid down. Others, they say it's the grasping shadows." "The what?" "Shadows that move," he said quietly. "They don't belong to anything living, but they're there, waiting. Some folks say they reach out, clawing at the wheels, steering you off the road. Sometimes they just disappear you altogether." I couldn't help but laugh, though it sounded hollow. "You believe that?" Thomas didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I believe enough to take the long way home." I chalked it up to small-town superstition, the kind of ghost story old-timers use to scare the young. But that night, the name stayed with me, lingering like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Weeks later, I found myself driving down Holloway Road. It wasn't by choice. I'd been visiting an old friend in the next town over, and roadwork had closed off the main highway. My GPS rerouted me, its cold, mechanical voice guiding me down the narrow, forgotten road. The name didn't register until I was already on it. The moment my tires hit the asphalt, the air seemed to thicken. The headlights barely cut through the heavy mist that clung to the road like a living thing. The trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just me and the endless, suffocating dark. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not the peaceful quiet of a rural night, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that pressed down on me like a physical weight. Even the hum of my engine seemed muted, swallowed by the dense fog. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but the sound was too deliberate, too insistent. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from just beyond the reach of my headlights. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, malicious, and hungry. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I approached a sharp curve. The fog seemed to thicken, the road disappearing into a wall of gray. That's when it happened. The wheel jerked violently in my hands, yanking to the right with a force that nearly ripped it from my grasp. My heart pounded as I fought to regain control, but it was like wrestling with a living thing. I felt them then, hands, cold and strong, wrapping around mine. They weren't visible, but their presence was undeniable. My skin crawled as the unseen fingers tightened, guiding the wheel toward the edge of the road where the trees waited like silent sentinels. The headlights caught something in the fog, a fleeting shape, twisted and unnatural, with hollow eyes that burned like coals. It was gone in an instant, but the image seared itself into my mind. I screamed, wrenching the wheel back with every ounce of strength I had. The car skidded, tires screeching against the asphalt, and I felt the cold grip loosen. The force vanished as suddenly as it had come, leaving me shaking and gasping for breath. The car came to a stop just inches from the guardrail. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the whispers fading into the oppressive silence once more. When I finally dared to step out, the air was still and heavy. The forest loomed around me, dark and impenetrable, but I could feel it watching. I made it home somehow, my mind racing with fragments of what I'd seen, what I'd felt. Thomas was sitting on his porch, his beer resting on the arm of his chair. He raised it in a silent toast as I pulled into the driveway, a knowing smile playing on his lips. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and went inside, locking the door behind me. Over the next few days, the unease gnawed at me, growing sharper with each passing moment. I replayed the incident over and over in my mind, the unseen grip on my hands, the whispers, the shape in the fog. No matter how much I told myself it was just a trick of the light or a mechanical glitch, the sensations were too vivid, too real to dismiss. My nights became restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel it, the cold, claw-like grip wrapping around my hands, pulling, guiding. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The oppressive silence of my house, once a comfort, now felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were watching. One morning, as I stepped out to grab groceries, I bumped into Hank. He was a fixture in the neighborhood, a man who seemed to exist solely on beer, sarcasm, and endless small-town gossip. He leaned against the rickety fence dividing our yards, holding a can of his usual cheap brew. "You're looking rough, Caleb," he said, tipping his hat back. "What's got you all twisted up?" I hesitated. Jim wasn't exactly the kind of guy you poured your heart out to, but something about his tone made me pause. Maybe it was the way his eyes narrowed, the faint glimmer of genuine concern beneath his usual smirk. "It's nothing," I said at first, brushing past him. But as I reached my car, the words spilled out before I could stop them. "I took Briar's Bend the other night." Jim froze mid-sip, the beer hovering inches from his lips. "At night?" he repeated, his voice low and tense. I nodded, suddenly feeling foolish. "Yeah, the highway was closed and it was the only route back. No big deal, no big deal," he echoed, setting the can down on the fence post. His casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by something colder, harder. "And yet here you are, jumpy as a cat in a dog kennel." "Let me guess. Something happened." I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Not really. The wheel jerked a bit, that's all. Probably hit a bad patch of road or something." Hank's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "A bad patch of road," he said slowly, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you're calling it?" "What else would it be?" I asked, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. Jim stepped closer, his gaze boring into mine. "I've lived here my whole damn life, Caleb. Seen more wrecks on that stretch of asphalt than I can count. And you know what every single driver says afterward? It was a bad patch of road. Then they swear they'll never drive it again." I crossed my arms, trying to mask the chill crawling up my spine. "So what? You're saying it wasn't the road?" "I'm saying it's the road and something else," Jim said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "People around here call them the hairy hands. Might sound like an old wives' tale to you, but I've seen enough to know better. Whatever it is, it doesn't want folks on that road, and it sure as hell doesn't like 'em driving through at night." I snorted, though the sound lacked conviction. "Come on, Hank. Ghost stories? Really?" He leaned back against the fence, folding his arms. "Believe what you want. Just know this, next time you might not be so lucky. Those hands don't let go twice." His words lingered long after he'd gone, echoing in my mind like a warning bell. I told myself it was all nonsense, that Jim was just another small-town relic clinging to superstitions. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Something was waiting on that road, and I'd been foolish enough to cross its path. And the worst part? I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. Hank's warning lingered like a splinter in my mind, and no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, curiosity gnawed at me. I wasn't ready to accept tales of ghostly hands, but there was no denying the unease that had settled over me. If nothing else, I wanted answers, ones rooted in logic, not superstition. My first stop was the library, tucked into a forgotten corner of the community center. It was barely more than a single room, with sagging shelves and the faint smell of mildew. Mrs. Lowry, the gray-haired librarian who knew everyone's business, was delighted to see someone taking an interest in the town's history. "Well, this is a treat," she said, pulling out a box of dusty clippings. "Most folks don't care about Briar's Bend beyond complaining about the potholes. But if you're looking for stories, I've got plenty." She wasn't kidding. The stack she handed me was a patchwork of yellowed newspapers and handwritten notes. some dating back to the 1920s. As I sifted through them, a grim pattern emerged. The headlines were chillingly repetitive. Fatal accident claims 2 on Briar's Bend. Local family mourns tragic crash, and driver mysteriously loses control. The language rarely varied. No clear cause, sharp veer, unexplained loss of control. One article from 1953 stood out. It recounted the story of a farmer whose horse-drawn cart had careened into a ditch. The farmer survived and insisted that invisible hands had yanked the reins from his grasp. Hysteria, the reporter had written dismissively, but the farmer's words chilled me. I felt them, cold as death, prying my fingers away. Another piece, from 1987, described a truck driver who barely escaped after his rig smashed into the trees. He swore something had wrenched the wheel from his hands. The official explanation? Driver fatigue. But the man's testimony was clear. I wasn't tired, and I wasn't alone in that cab. As I read on, the stories became more fragmented but eerily similar. Every decade had its casualties. Some survivors spoke of unseen forces, others refused to talk at all. I began asking around, though I quickly learned who was willing to share and who wasn't. The younger folks waved me off with chuckles and rolled eyes, but the older residents had a different air, somber, wary. They didn't tell stories so much as warnings. "There's something wrong with that road," one woman told me in a hushed voice. My uncle swore he saw hands, big and hairy, right on his wheel before his car flipped. He never drove again. Others offered darker theories. One man leaned in close, his breath heavy with tobacco. "That road's cursed," he said, "built on blood. A settler was strung up there witchcraft," they said. "Now he don't let no one pass without his say-so." A frail old-timer added his take, voice rasping like dry leaves. "It's the farmer," he muttered. "Killed his kin, then himself, but he didn't leave. He's out there, grabbing at anyone who gets too close." It was hard to tell what was truth, what was legend, and what was sheer fabrication, but the sheer weight of the stories pressed down on me. Too many people, too many years, too many eerie similarities. I left the library feeling like I'd stumbled into something far older and far darker than I could understand. As much as I wanted to dismiss it, the threads of the tale wrapped around me, drawing me back to that road. I told myself I just needed to see it in the daylight, to prove to myself that it was nothing more than a cracked, winding stretch of asphalt with a bad reputation. But when the moment came, it wasn't daylight. It was a cold, clear night, the moon hanging low and bright in the sky. I didn't plan to go back, not really. But there I was, gripping my keys, stepping into the car, and driving toward Briar's Bend. I wasn't chasing answers anymore. I was chasing the truth. And maybe, just maybe, I was chasing the hands themselves. The road seemed to pulse with a sinister energy as I sat there, dazed and struggling to breathe. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the cooling engine and the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. My hands trembled as I pried them off the wheel, the phantom sensation of that crushing grip lingering like a bruise on my skin. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. The hands, if that's even what they were, had felt stronger this time, more deliberate. It was as if they wanted me to lose control, to crash. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help, but my fingers kept slipping, and when I finally got it out of my pocket, the screen was dead. No signal, no light, nothing. "Of course," I muttered bitterly, my voice hoarse and raw. I glanced up at the windshield. It was cracked but still intact, spiderweb fractures glinting faintly in the moonlight. The tree loomed in front of the car like a silent witness to my ordeal. Then I heard it. A faint rustling sound came from the woods, just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of something dragging across the ground. My blood turned to ice. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a faint tapping on the hood of my car. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, almost curious. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, squinting through the cracked windshield. There was nothing there, just shadows and the gnarled branches of the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and thin. I hated how small it sounded, how afraid I was. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, without warning, the car's headlights flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape, but the handle wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, yanking with all my strength, but it was like the door was welded shut. A low, guttural noise rose from the woods, a sound that wasn't quite human. It was deep and wet, like something struggling to breathe. My chest tightened as the noise grew louder, closer, wrapping around me like a shroud. I slammed my fists against the door, shouting now, my voice raw and frantic. "Let me out! Let me out!" The temperature inside the car plummeted, frost creeping across the cracked glass like skeletal fingers. My breath came out in visible puffs, each one quicker than the last. And then, I felt it again, that pressure on my hands. This time, it wasn't on the wheel. It was on the door, on the seat, on me. The grip was cold and unrelenting, pinning me in place. I thrashed against it, but it was no use. It was everywhere, suffocating and inescapable. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the faint outline of something in the rearview mirror, long fingers, matted with hair, reaching toward me. The truck's cabin was warm, but I couldn't stop shivering. My hands trembled so badly that the water sloshed inside the bottle. The woman, her name patch read Carla, kept her eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at me with concern. "Briar's Bend, huh?" Carla muttered after a while. "Should have guessed. That stretch of road's got a bad reputation." I managed a weak croak. "You've heard the stories?" "Stories?" She snorted. "More like warnings. I've been running this route for years and I avoid that damn bend whenever I can. Too many accidents, too many close calls." She cast me a sideways glance. "Guess you didn't hear the warnings." I shook my head. "I didn't think they were real. Well, now you know." Her tone was grim, but there was no judgment in it, just the tired resignation of someone who'd seen too much. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the winding road ahead. I couldn't stop looking at the side mirrors, half expecting to see something, someone, following us. But the woods stayed still, a suffocating void of shadows and silence. "What did you see?" Carla asked, breaking the tension. Her voice was quiet, as if she already knew the answer. I hesitated, staring down at my raw, aching hands. "Something grabbed me," I admitted finally. "I couldn't see it, but it was there. It tried to choke me." Carla didn't react right away. She kept driving, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, a small, curt motion. "Sounds about right." I blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "Couple years back, I picked up a hitchhiker near here," she said, her voice steady but low. Guy looked like he'd seen a ghost, shaking, pale, barely able to talk. Said he'd been forced off the road by something that wasn't there. He kept rambling about hands, hairy hands. She paused, her knuckles tightening on the wheel. I thought he was just rattled, but the way he looked, I don't know, gave me the creeps. The truck rumbled over a pothole, jostling us both. Carla adjusted the wheel and continued. "After that, I started hearing more stories. Locals say it's a curse, that the road's haunted by someone who died angry, real angry. Maybe it's true, or maybe the place just has a way of messing with people's heads." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of shared fear. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that I'd never drive Briar's Bend again. Carla dropped me off at a diner on the outskirts of town. She didn't linger, just made sure I was steady on my feet before climbing back into her truck. "Take care of yourself," she said, her voice softer now. "And next time, stick to the main roads." I watched her taillights disappear into the night, leaving me standing in the glow of the diner's neon sign. I still didn't understand what had happened or why, but one thing was clear. Briar's Bend wasn't just a road. It was something else, something hungry. And it wasn't done with me yet. Carla tightened her grip on the wheel, her jaw clenching as if weighing her response. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the cab over uneven pavement. "I think," she said finally, her voice low and deliberate, "that some places aren't meant for people. Briar's Bend, that stretch of road, it's got a feeling to it, like it doesn't want you there." She glanced at me, her sharp eyes flicking to my bruised neck. I don't know if it's ghosts or curses or just a whole lot of bad luck piled up over the years, but I do know this. Every time I've driven it, I feel like I'm being watched. Like the road itself is waiting for me to screw up. I swallowed hard, her words stirring an unease I couldn't shake. "You ever see anything?" I asked, though my throat protested with every word. Carla hesitated again, her gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. "No," she admitted, her tone clipped, "but I've felt it. That pressure, like someone sitting on your chest. And once, just once, I swear the wheel tried to pull out of my hands." She flexed her fingers on the steering wheel as if remembering the sensation. "But I fought back, told whatever it was to piss off. Didn't happen again." Her bluntness should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. If someone like Carla, practical, grounded, no nonsense, believed there was something unnatural about Briar's Bend, then maybe the stories weren't just stories. We rode in silence for a while, the truck's high beams carving a path through the dark. I could feel her glancing at me every now and then, like she was trying to decide whether to say more. Finally, she broke the silence. "Listen," she said, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I don't know what you went through back there, and I'm not going to pretend I do, but if you're smart, you'll stay away from that place. Some roads, they don't let go easy." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts were too tangled, my body too drained. All I could do was nod weakly and hope she was wrong. When we reached the edge of town, Carla pulled into a gas station and parked the truck. She turned to me, her expression a mix of sternness and concern. "This is as far as I go," she said. "You got someone you can call?" I nodded, fumbling for my phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. "Thanks," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Carla gave a curt nod. "Take care of yourself, kid, and remember what I said. Stay away from that road." I climbed out of the truck and watched as she drove off, her taillights disappearing into the night. The gas station attendant gave me a curious look, but didn't ask any questions as I called a cab. As I waited, I couldn't help but glance back in the direction of Briar's Bend. The road was miles away now, hidden by the trees and the hills, but I could still feel its pull, its hunger. Carla was right. Some roads don't let go easy, and I wasn't sure Briar's Bend was done with me yet. The whiskey burned as I poured another shot, the amber liquid catching the faint morning light seeping through the curtains. My hand still trembled, though less from fear now and more from exhaustion. The adrenaline of the night had ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache in its place. I wasn't going back to Briar's Bend, that much was clear. But the question of why still gnawed at me, sharp and persistent. Why me? Why that road? Why now? My phone buzzed on the table, startling me enough to spill a few drops from my glass. It was a text from an old friend, Jamie, who I hadn't spoken to in months. "Heard about your crash last night. You okay?" Word travels fast in small towns. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to respond, but what could I even say? "Yeah, I'm fine. Just nearly strangled by some invisible hands on a cursed road." Instead, I typed a simple reply. "I'm okay. Thanks for checking in." I set the phone down and rubbed my temples, the throbbing headache from my collision refusing to let up. The thing was, I had questions. Too many of them, in fact. What had happened to me wasn't random. Carla's words echoed in my mind. Some roads don't let go easy. Briar's Bend wasn't just dangerous. It was alive, in some malevolent, predatory way. I grabbed a notebook from the junk drawer and began scribbling notes. Every detail I could remember about last night, every sensation, every sound, static on the radio, the force pulling the wheel, the hands. I wrote until my hand cramped, the pages filling with fragmented memories and half-formed theories. As the morning wore on, one thing became clear. I wasn't going back to Briar's Bend, but I wasn't going to forget it either. That road wasn't done with me, no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise. I just had to make sure I was ready if, or when, it called me again. In the months that followed, the stories kept coming. Whispers of more accidents, strange and unexplained, spread through the town like wildfire. A motorcycle that suddenly veered off the road into the trees. A pickup truck that flipped over on a sharp curve. Every detail was the same. No signs of a crash, no cause that made sense, and always that eerie, unshakable feeling that something unseen had been at work. I kept my distance from Ashwood, but the town wasn't ready to let me forget. Jim would swing by now and then, always eager to share the latest tale to hands. "Did you hear about the Jenkins boy?" he said one afternoon, leaning over the fence, his cigarette dangling from his lips. "Wrecked his dad's Camaro on Briar's Bend. Said his hands were ripped off the wheel." I nodded, but I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. I didn't need to encourage him. Jim squinted at me, his grin crooked. "You got lucky, Caleb. Most people don't walk away from that road." "I know," I muttered, my voice quiet. The weight of his words sank in deeper each time. As the months passed, I tried to live my life again. I went back to work, started fixing up the house, even joined a local bowling league to keep myself distracted. But the memory of that night never left me. It lingered in the corners of my mind, creeping up at the strangest moments. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night, my hands clutching at my throat, as if the hands were still there, reaching for me. Other times I'd find myself avoiding the dark stretches of road that I once drove with ease, my heart pounding for no reason I could name. I tried to convince myself it was all just a bad dream, that the hands weren't real. But deep down, I knew the truth. They were out there, watching, waiting. Ashwood was a place where the past refused to let go, where something malevolent lurked just beneath the surface. And I wasn't foolish enough to think that something was gone, that it had forgotten about me. It didn't care who I was or what I believed. All it cared about was pulling me into the darkness. If you ever find yourself in a quiet town and someone warns you about a road like Ashwood, listen. Don't be like me. Don't ignore the warnings. Take the long way home, because some things are better left alone. The hands don't need a reason. And if you're unlucky enough to be out there when they reach for you, there might not be anyone around to save you the next time.